Hello. Welcome to another Geotech Hour. I'm your host, Dr. David Bray, Inaugural Director for the Atlantic Council's Geotech Center. We're here today with an august panel to talk about the world in 2021 onwards, what we need to do for more people-centered actions when it comes to data, tech, and society. Now, we all know there's going to be a big event that happens in the United States in November. We're going to get past that event, and the question is, after that event, what does the world look like and what should we do? The Atlantic Council itself, we're nonpartisan. We try to lead with recognizing that there are values, and those values are things that anybody can embody, regardless of geography, party, affiliation, what have you. The strongest value we have is we lead with allies. We're stronger together with allies. And I would say here at the Geotech Center, we try to encourage positive change agents, those individuals who are willing to be benevolent, bold, and brave. I'd like to turn first to our guest, Tricia. Tricia, could you real quick introduce yourself, and what would you say are the things that we should be thinking about and doing past 2021 onwards to help uplift societies and people as a whole?
David, I'm so excited to be here for my first session with y'all. So I am the co-founder of Set and Compass, and we work with companies to ensure that they're using big data analytics in a human-centered way. So we work with them to really integrate that data strategy into their products and to how they grow. And I know that sounds like cool, but it actually is so difficult because most organizations just want to only use quant data without actually thinking about the people part. So that segues into like what I think is the most important issue. I actually have three topics, but I'm only going to bring up one of them right now so that we can hear from everybody else. But I think the most important thing now, and I'm going to use this phrase only once because I hate it when I hear it, but more than ever, only once, and no one else is allowed to use it now that I use it because it's like so annoying. But no, I'm joking. But seriously, I think that more than ever, data is old. Like, I'm just going to say that flat out. Your quantitative data, all that data that you invested so much in building out all of your recommendation engines, all the algorithmic systems that you invested in, all the analytics, all the data lake, and which was important to actually collect all that quantitative data about your customers and to try and make predictions or create efficiencies. But all of that is, if you're in a customer-facing organization, all of that is old now. And what I mean by that, I'm saying that, and it sounds a bit controversial, but what I mean by that is that the world has changed. We are in a historic moment of spatial collapse where all of our understandings of home, of work, of how we socialize, all of that has collapsed onto each other. And I don't want to get into that right now, but that is a massive sociological change where the way we move through the world, the way we conceive of the world has changed, the way we relate to each other. And that means that all the ways that of our understanding of our customers and what we thought they would do is really changing. So you can't just make decisions if your business strategy and your data strategy has not changed for how you want to understand your customers. And it hasn't changed since now we're in a pandemic for 2021 and on, then I would say you're really big trouble. And the way I see this most is in organizations that are obsessed with being quant driven, where they say they're being data driven, and they've invested all this money in qualitative data, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, but they did it in isolation of the qualitative, of making sure that it was always integrated into the people, the experts, the functions that actually understood people. And if there's this obsession with what I've seen is called the quantification bias, and this is something I've seen is a new bias of the data-driven era, where people are so biased towards anything that is quantifiable, that anything that is not, not in the form of numbers, it's really hard for people to pay, especially leaders, to take seriously. But I think right now, given that everything has changing, most of the things you need to understand have not ended up in numbers. They have not been quantified. We haven't even identified those variables yet. So I would say that that's organizations, I think the biggest thing is they're going to have to look at is not just do we look at our quant data, our big data, but how do we gather that thick data, the qualitative data. So thick data is just the term I made up to make qualitative data sound fancy and sexy, but it's that you need to make sure you gather data about people, and you need to prioritize that as the number one thing you do for any governments, any agencies, all companies. You better figure out who is helping you understand people.
Excellent. Well, and Tricia, I was thinking as you were saying that to make it sort of real for our listeners, it's sort of like how, probably 2018, 2019, there were companies that had algorithms that said, I might be able to offer you between your commute from home to work a discount for a cup of coffee, or the way home from work, here's a discount for getting something to eat. But obviously now in COVID-19, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
So
I love that example. And one of the examples from our work, from our clients, we have a lot of people who work in retail. And the biggest change, I was like, are your recommendation algorithms still telling people to buy pants? Because we're not wearing pants anymore. I would say that most of us maybe don't have the pants that match right now. And if we do, thank you. It's a miracle. And I congratulate you. There you go. See? And it's okay. But
first Geotek hour in which people have now said we're not wearing.
Yeah. But why are you recommending pants when what people really want to buy is tops, And so that is based on old data and old understandings of how we interact with people. So I love that you made it real, that example. That's something we're seeing right now with some of our, brick and mortar clients.
Very good. I appreciate that. And I think we're going to dive a little bit more into how we can make a data-driven society better as we dive deeper into this. This is actually a really great segue to a mutual friend, Dion, also first time here at the Geotek Hour, and you've been helping to lead a lot of positive change efforts and successful organizational transformation efforts. I guess I would ask you, so real quick, introduce yourself, and what do you think we should be both acting on and doing together more as a society in 2021 onwards?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David. I appreciate being here. I'm VP and Principal Analyst at Constellation Research. I actually work for Ray over there. So after November, the world is going to be different in some very definite ways. And one thing that's most likely is that it'll be a little more certain than it was before. And this is going to allow a lot of people to focus on what we really need to do, which is a renaissance. We need to revitalize and we need to rebuild the world, our economies, our societies. We learned a lot in 2020, and we need to take those lessons and actually act on them, right? So, gathering new ground truth, we can do that with data if we want to. But when I talk to organizations, they're trying to figure out what they need to do in 2021. We all have limited resources. And I love that introduction, David, you had where you said, well, we can do a lot more together with allies. And we're going to need to do that. We're going to need to create the consortiums and the working groups and the councils that will come together and solve some of these really difficult problems, like making sure we can get to an effective vaccine quicker, get it distributed faster, figure out how to keep people with food on their table and businesses operating while we recover. That's going to require real policy prescriptions. If there's any time for a government to really step in and take leadership, that 2021 is the year for that. And we'll have a more stable government by that time, hopefully. And we'll be able to do that. And I think that these are the things we need to be holding hands. We need to be gathering our resources. We need to be gathering our data and insights. And we need to be learning from this year to make next year and the years after much better. That's what I think.
Excellent. And maybe real quick, if I could ask you a quick rejoinder, Dion. You said, companies are trying to figure out where they place their bets given limited resources. Are you seeing any new approaches in how they think about placing their bets, or new approaches, or is it that we just need to have the same toolbox just in a much more turbulent, changing environment? I mean, what are you seeing in terms of how companies
I just completed a survey of top digital leaders, and we got some pretty clear signals out of that. One, digital transformation has suddenly become the top focus. It used to be things like cybersecurity or analytics. It is now getting to whatever your new business is going to be, because patterns of everything have changed, right? As Tricia was noting. We have to adjust our businesses dramatically to reflect that. And it's gone from a really important thing to do to the number one priority. And then things like automation. That's the other very, very clear signal we see, that people want to automate. They have to do much more with much less, and that's how you do it. So that's what we're seeing. Very
tangible. I appreciate that. Thank you. I would now like to turn to a very strong friend of the Atlantic Council, one of our greatest senior fellows, Melissa. Real quick, if you could introduce yourself, and similar to ask the question, what do you think we should be acting on and working together when it comes to 2021 onwards?
Thanks so much, David. It's always fun to be here. I spent a couple of decades in emerging technology, mostly in the public sector. Started at state, spent a lot of years working for the Department of Defense in various ways, shapes, and forms, with a few brief periods out in the real world with the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago, as well as running my own consulting gig, and one failed startup in my past. So I don't know if that gives me legitimacy in some weird way. But these days, I'm a senior fellow over at Georgetown, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow here at the Geotech Center. And I'm going to take a slightly different perspective on this because I really do come from a public sector perspective. And that is, I actually think things are going to get a little more challenging before they get better. And I think that when we come to November, we're actually going to not have an answer in the United States quickly. And there's going to be a lot of fear, and there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. And there's already a lot of fear and uncertainty piled on top of this population because of unemployment and a bad economic situation. We didn't pass another stimulus, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are some concrete things that we need to consider doing in this period. And a lot of that is actually empowering people at more the local and state level to come together and start listening commissions and to start growing sort of groups that can represent them in a very authentic way. And we need to bubble that up to state and regional and federal levels so that we're actually hearing directly from people on what are the new problems that need to be solved. I think we need to be very careful about talking about tech in the same frames. Tricia, I'm so excited to hear you talking about this sort of unknown aspect of where we are and that this is a pivot point. But also these human models, we need to develop this sort of new human frame and think about, so automation and digital transformation could just be one more layer in driving inequality. It could be one more way of minimizing sort of educational access for a large swath of the population. So I think we have to really think about how we bring these frames to people who've been displaced in tourism, in the food services industry, in a lot of the services that have been maybe foundationally shaken, if not taken away over the next couple of years. But I think that there's real opportunity in change. It's just scary. So we have to find ways to get people really engaged and feeling heard and feeling like they have an authentic representation that maybe is not through these traditional models of government either. And I think we have to do that quickly.
I agree with you on the quickening part. And maybe real quick, before I go to Ray, Melissa, given that, that government is, of course, overseen by laws, these laws are passed by Congress, and, short of new laws, have you seen examples of experiments that we can do without waiting for permission that allows us to come up with new ways of listening and engaging, or things that give you hope?
I think we should really be reaching to philanthropy. We've never really engaged philanthropy through the lens of national security in a positive form. I really think that having a conversation with some of the largest sort of industry leaders, some of the largest philanthropic donors, and probably some large academic institutions, some of these large academic endowments in a few places are as large as some of these philanthropic endowments as well. I think we need to sit down and talk to them about taking some responsibility. And specifically, I think we've got to really send a signal to industry that the financialization of every single aspect of our society hasn't worked. And we now have an inequality at the level greater than like the French Revolution, right? History doesn't treat that very well. So they all have an incentive to lean in hard and make space for other people's voices so that their voices can continue to profit.
Very well said, and I'm hoping we don't discover what the equivalent of Madame Guillotine is for the 21st century, but yeah, those are things worth worrying about and being addressing in a positive way. So Ray, welcome, glad to have you here. You're also a Geotech Senior Fellow, and you are doing amazing things with constellation research. If you could real quick introduce yourself, and what trends are you seeing that we should be taking action on in 2021 onwards?
Yeah, definitely. We bring one with constellation research based out in Silicon Valley. And one of the things that we typically spend time thinking about is PESTLE, which is our futurist framework, thinking about what's happening. And we've had to revise that, of course, given what's happened, but a lot of it's remained the same. There are three areas that we actually think are important. I think the first one is really these massive digital divides, similar to what Melissa's talking about, but they're generational. Their business model, and there's definitely creating clear winners and losers in this post-pandemic economy and society. And I think that's very important to understand how they're taking shape. And they're really taking shape because of data. these organizations have data that create what we call digital feedback loops. And these feedback loops allow them to create flywheel effects that allow them to figure out decisions faster than anyone else. I mean, they can make decisions faster. They can see trends faster. They can mitigate risk more quickly than any other. And that's when you get to 50 to 100 million users or 50 to 100 million devices where they come together and they're providing that signal intelligence, which leads to what we call decision velocity, right? If you can make decisions faster than everyone else, you're going to win. And you've seen that in wars. You've seen that in political operations. You've seen that before, just in managing, media sentiment. And so that big piece around digital divides is happening. The second one, which I think you guys will talk a lot about as well, is the US versus China war. We've got two different systems competing. We've got a lot of weak countries in between. And I say weak because they are economically challenged, cannot make a decision, cannot stand on their own, and have become dependent on China along the way, or dependent on the US, depending what view you're taking. And I think it's important for them to understand how they're making those decisions. But we basically have wars coming on standards, anything from medicine to technology to foreign policy to a belief on freedom and rights to what humanity should look like. And that war is only going to escalate, and I think it's going to play a big part of what we all see. And then the last piece is really this war coming from autonomous enterprises and automation. The top questions everyone's going to ask in every single organization is basically, when do we go full intelligent automation? When do we augment the machine with the human? When do we augment the human with the machine? And when do we trust human judgment? And so I think I'll leave you with those three.
Wow, very controversial, but also very true to what we're seeing. So Ray, if I could ask you real quick, you used the word war when you were talking about tensions between China and the United States. I assume you're talking about this could be in the frame of a Cold War or other things like that. I guess the question is, do you have any advice for companies not to get stuck in the crosshairs of either that or the challenge and the tensions about automation? How do companies not get pulled into nationalism given these challenges ahead?
I think companies are already being pulled and asked to make a choice. For example, if you're Facebook and you can't operate in China because you're blocked by the government, you've already made that choice. If you're a large electronic vehicle company, or if you're a large pharmaceutical and you have to make a choice in operations production in China versus production in the US, unless China needs you, there's no reason for them to let you in, right? From an IP perspective, we've seen that time over time. So while there's something for them to gain, yes, you'll be able to do business. And 10 years out, you might be asked to leave and leave all your stuff there, right? And so we're seeing those types of policies. So I think companies are getting smart to realize that they have to make those choices. But you're right, it's not an actual war until someone tries to take land. Then we're going to see something there. But it's still a war because we're in a cyber war, we're in a bioweapons war, we are in a economic war, we're in a war for ideas, and so it's really a war. If you look at it anything else, I think you're missing the point. We're in the middle of war, and no one's called it yet.
Yep, I agree. I think it may even be multiple cognitive Cold Wars plural in the things that are mainly invisible, because it doesn't ratchet it up to the public's awareness to the point where it actually has to become a shooting war. It's just.
But there's a war on the dollar too as a reserve currency. There's another one. Here's even another example right there. So
yeah, you're right. All the different and misinformation, disinformation, supply chains. These are all challenges we face. So I'm going to go now next to Trisha and then to Melissa. So Trisha, I know you've done a lot to try and advocate for recognizing a more human-centric approach. And it seems like if there was a common theme in what we were hearing, it was about both recognizing that our old ways of doing data are not sufficient, and that we may need to figure out ways to empower people. And I was wondering, are you seeing glimmers of hope there? And what can the private sector do to encourage new models that are doing data with people as opposed to just to people?
Yeah, I think like the first thing that is really important is, as what Dion was saying, is that now digital transformation is really important to organizations, is that they have a chance to do this right, which is that the first time when organizations try to take a path, they treated digital transformation as mainly a technical process. And what we know is that it's not that. But then they would be like, well, we just need to bring in like more people and more consultants to kind of make it about innovation. So the pendulum swung to the other side for people to do like fancy things, like they really thought it was about creating technology and like making apps and just doing stuff that wasn't really totally helpful, and also didn't, wasn't people centric, nor did it actually increase, the ROI of the investment. And I think right now, for my recommendation, it's not only to the private sector, but to the public sector, is that it's something that Melissa has said, which is a phrase, which is about building human models, is that we actually have a chance now where you actually have to understand what is the new human model of interaction. And the reason why you need to do that is because, especially for investing in AI, you need to create really solid data models. But if you look at every single snafu when it has with AI, and anytime these decisions go awry, it's because that whoever the engineering group was, they built something, made all these assumptions about the data, and they used all these inputs thinking like, oh, it's just like a neutral decision. We use a historical algorithm, just like how the weather is historical. And then you apply that to people, and then you're like, oh, but we didn't collect data on race. We never talked about, income. But you're just like, well, actually, if you're collecting zip code data and racism has been encoded into zip code, and there's been like hundreds of years of police, racial profiling and all of these things that we do to communities and ravage them, that's going to show up in the zip code. And so anytime you're dealing with people, you have to actually make sure that your data model, build that out, you really understand the human model. And the human model is changing really quickly right now. And especially with what Melissa was saying, is that we have a massive issue in inequality. And people are starting to ask now, am I being represented in this data set? And not only am I being represented, but what a company or organization or entity should be asking is, who gets to make those decisions of who gets represented and what counts as representation? And those are questions. I don't want to bring up the word ethics because I think that can be hairy and like people just like, what are ethics? That doesn't help us make money, or doesn't really help us make decisions. It's like, well, okay, so we don't have to bring up the word ethics, but these are questions that everyone should be asking. Are your people who are in charge of your data processes, your AI process, are they actually working with people who really know how to understand a human model? And that means, are you working with business-minded anthropologists? I'm not saying go find academics, because sometimes academics are the worst, I would say most of the time they are. If you don't have any industry and execution and actual driving actual real world execution on either in the public or private sector, it's really difficult. But there is a whole new group of academics and people who are just really well trained, who really understand that you have to think about things holistically. And that sometimes those people can just come from weird places and have weird backgrounds. But those are the people you need to have at the table to really ask who is being represented in our data, so that we can actually apply these amazing technologies, amazing advancements in AI, but making sure that all of the algorithms are being done in such a way where you're thinking about people from day one, before you even write the algorithm, before you even choose the type of Bayesian analysis that you're going to do.
Very well said. I believe the research actually shows, both the work of Anita Woolsey and Tom Malone shows, that a diversity of participants does lead to better outcomes for a business. We here at the Atlantic Council, we have been writing with the Geotech Center about making sure you don't let your data be weaponized against marginalized groups. You don't let implicit or unconscious racism creep into things. And so very well said, Tricia. And I think, Ray, you look like you were quick to do a rejoinder before I go to Melissa. Did you have a real quick rejoinder before I go to Melissa, or are you good to go, Ray?
I'm actually good. I think the one thing I would add is that if we take data and we look at self-sovereign identity going forward, I think that's going to be one way to actually create more equality in the sense of, as your data is being used for other purposes and being monetized or even being weaponized against you, we really need to come to terms as to how that data is being, the ownership of that data, and how that data is actually being used. And I think there's a lot of work that was being done by Doc Searles and Joyce Searles in the past. I think there's something very useful to take a look at. But now if you want to use my data, you got to pay for it, or there's permission for it, or it's part of a human right. I think those are interesting concepts that have been brought up before. And so I think, it might be your first step to UBI, though I don't agree with UBI, but it might be a way to get you to UBI if you want to at least get paid for your data. So.
All right, so after Melissa, then I'm going to go to Dion and then to Ray about private sector perspectives on automation and UBI. So just you guys get ready, but I'm going to go to Melissa first to continue the conversation about how can we do data in a more human-centric way. So Melissa.
I want to pull on something that Ray was just saying. About a decade ago, I saw an art film that was very controversial. I think it was Danish, possibly Dutch. And it was called Enjoy Poverty. And this guy literally trekked around to some of these ravaged countries in Africa where a lot of Western media were there taking pictures, winning prizes for it, making lots of money on their photos and their journalism. And he basically started telling people, your most valuable resource is your poverty. So you should start requiring them to pay you if they want to take your pictures and all of these things. It was very controversial, and it was both funny.
Is this the Renzo Martin film?
I'm not sure, maybe. But when you tell me about monetizing your data, I feel similarly because people feel so disempowered. These scientists show up occasionally, or these companies show up, or the government shows up and the data's gone and I don't even know it was taken, right? They made money on it and I didn't even know that it was made. And it's a very interesting parallel in my mind. So I do think it's an interesting and hugely controversial in the implementation, but it's an interesting way to begin to think of the fact that maybe there are ways to actually monetize that make people think about what they're taking from each individual. I kind of love that idea. So I also think that we really have to realize that we've stimulated some distrust in science in the last year. I think that this pandemic kind of merging with this description of hyper quantification that Tricia started with is a fascinating challenge for science. Science is a long slog. We learn, we take 2 steps forward, we take a step back, we take 2 more steps forward, we learn that we were actually wrong, we take 6 steps back, we take another path. The scientific model, hypothesize, establish an experiment, see whether you're right-ish or wrong-ish, and reestablish the next experiment. This is something that accretes over time. And instead, we're taking snapshots, we're taking ends of one, we're taking one, this happened to 1 person or 10 people or 17 people, and we're piecing together knowledge of a pandemic that we will not understand for 2 decades. And people are getting uncomfortable because they're getting conflicting information, and everyone wants to quantify everything so desperately. We're reading numbers for tests and for positives and for deaths and for hospitalizations and for ICU saturation, and we're reading it every day for every state and every town and every county and every country. And we're believing it and we're not believing it, and we believe it one day and then they tell us it was all wrong. And you're asking people now to just trust you because they give you a number. So I really feel strongly that if we don't find a mixed method approach to this future, where we really do knit together a way to really get people to trust that this data can help us have a better life. It can help us have more personalized medicine and more equal education and a more transparent approach to taking the snow off my streets in Chicago or wherever, right? We have to help people with their problems at their doorstep. If we don't find a way to do that, people will opt out of these systems. And we already see this with groups of people saying, I don't want to be polled. I don't want to respond to the census. I don't want to respond to some of these structural things that used to be sort of a knee-jerk, yeah, sure, I just do it. Because they don't want their data to be used in ways that feel like it could be used against them. So I'm really interested in how do we actually start to bring these conversations around what are your problems? And I think if we have groups coming together at more local, state and regional levels, deciding what their problems are, the federal government should just be matching funds and providing support to helping those groups solve their own problems. And not deciding what the problem is, and that we will determine the problem and we will determine who can work on it. And we will decide all the rules and we'll call it a public-private partnership. That's not the future in my mind if we want to get to where Tricia is talking about. And I'm in such agreement with her description of this situation.
Excellent, Melissa. And I know, Tricia, you had a real quick rejoinder before I go to Dion. So go ahead, Tricia.
Yes, this is a step. I just want to make sure we talk about this before we get into the topic that Dion's going to come on, is that Ray and Melissa are talking about with personal data, is that I think that right now, our only conception for how we talk about personal data is through the lens of privacy. But one thing that I've been really pushing for is that privacy is really just the way we talk about our personal information. As right now, we talk about it as separate from us, as a piece of property that can be measured, negotiated over, sold, and reused. And that is how we think about privacy, because that serves corporations. And that's why solutions, market solutions are fine. You know, what Ray is talking about. If you want to think about privacy, selling, and, you know, owning your data. But what we're really talking about here, these are two separate topics that I wanted to disentangle, is that that's about privacy. But what we're really, when we're talking about disempowerment and people feeling marginalized, is that the data that is being collected doesn't just belong to you in the way that your house or car belongs to you. It is also you. So privacy is about our ability to control information about ourselves. What we really are talking about is personhood, which is the fundamental agency that we have as human beings. It is our ability to self-determine our own life decisions and outcomes. And right now, personhood is being violated because these systems are, especially increasingly autonomous, are taking away people's agency, which moves us into the realm of human rights. And right now what's happening, and the reason why it's all mixed together in this like confusing bag, is because both privacy and personhood are now being mediated digitally together. So it's like a quantum particle where your data can be both about ownership and privacy in the corporate sense, right? Or it can also be about your personhood, and it can exist in both places. And so violations of privacy are, when it comes to data, is about violations of commodity, and it is about ownership. But right now, what we're also talking about is violations of personhood. They're about violations of the actual person being represented by that data. And that's why we're seeing more and more groups that are marginalized getting very upset, saying, well, you know, all this data has been collected without my permission. And they're getting it, you know, sometimes they're just like, oh, you can't own it. But really, these are two separate issues. And what I want to be able to see happen in 2021 with the help of many people here is that we need to start bringing some nuance and some critical thinking to the way we talk about these terms, disentangle it so we don't get people all, you know, upset over the wrong things. Like, let's get upset about the right thing. We're upset about, when are we upset about personhood? And when are we upset about privacy as a commodity? And let's figure out the solutions as it, you know, addresses both of these things separately.
Very well said.
Wow. Juxtaposition and entanglement in personhood and privacy. Look at that.
Quantum
Trisha.
I think we're playing Scrabble here. Let's see. I think we can get the triple word score. I was just going to say, Trisha, that I agree with you very strongly. And I think it even gets even more challenging because we're seeing more and more companies do inferences. So it may not even be that you even gave the data. It's just simply because you live in this zip code, I assume you're like this, when in fact you may not be like that at all. So it's inferences about your personhood that may very well be wrong, but you don't even have the chance to correct.
No, muted.
No, there you go.
I was muted. And the people who are most impacted by this are people who are marginalized. The people who have the most privilege will have the ability to negotiate their personhood and the visibility of their data and their privacy. Those who are most impacted are oftentimes people of color, communities of color who are indigenous, and our technologies, the people developing them don't actually think about how they're represented, because oftentimes, as we know from NIST, an endless test is that algorithmic ways of facial recognition, you know, especially they don't know how to recognize Asians, Blacks, Latinx populations, indigenous populations. Like, if you don't look like usually a white person, oftentimes the machine misreads you. So you're totally right about inference. And we're going to see more of these issues. We already see Black people being arrested for crimes that they didn't even commit, because it's combined along with historical prejudices that you see in with police stations that are really run by oftentimes by white people who don't have the trust of the community. It's a bad combination.
Very well said. And I think we obviously think of a new way forward. So hopefully 2021 can be that way. I now like to go to Dion, because I told you we're going to circle back to automation, but maybe link this to all the things that Trisha just said. If we move to a future that's going to be using machine learning, algorithms, and automation, how do we make sure we don't end up in a dystopian 1984 like saga? So can you solve that for us, Dion, please?
Well, sure. Yeah. I wish that I could. I mean, the challenge is that we're riding an exponential curve of tech change, and it doesn't follow, it doesn't match our speed at which we can pass laws or figure out regulations or new cultural norms or anything. I mean, that the change is been, by and large, been very good for humans, right? It's only now we're beginning to understand some of the negative consequences. And so, you know, the challenge we have with automation, if you look at the big picture, let's talk a little long term, because we're still in the cave painting days of all of this. Digital technology is only a few decades old, right? We're going to be living with it probably for hundreds more years. So we're at the very, very beginning of this journey. And if you look at, you know, eventually everything that can be automated will be, which will be just about everything. And the chances that you can reskill into something that a robot can't do, it will be increasingly unlikely, as it'll exceed your maximum achievable educational attainment level, right? So what does that mean? I mean, you referenced UBI, Universal Basic Income, which says that, you know, maybe it isn't, you know, best to make everyone attempt to try and scrape out a living. Well, we are probably missing, you know, many of the next great Mozarts or Banksys or whatever by forcing people to try and figure out where is their role in a rapidly changing economic environment. And so I do think that regulation and policy is going to be a huge force in slowing this stuff down just a little bit, so that we can wrap our arms around it as a society and as a culture. Because we're going to have to change some things. There's no doubt about it. And because technology is a force multiplier. It is the greatest force multiplier ever achieved by humans, and so it warps everything, good and bad. And everyone wants the valuation of a technology company, but no one wants all the downsides of 1984, right? The whole Orwellian thing, which is where we're going, right? So we're going to have to hit the brakes. We're seeing that in Europe, right? To say, let's figure out how we're going to adjust workers' lives so that everyone still has the same rights and still same access to them, and be able to benefit from all these digital innovations, which are tremendous. I mean, look at this healthcare alone, what technology has given humans. The human lifespan and global population growth is all entirely due to technology, which we've created. So we want to tap into those good pieces, but now we're seeing how people are figuring out now how to weaponize all of this, and that's what we have to figure out. And it's going to require a lot of big thinking, and it's going to require us to slow some things down while we figure that out. And that's, I think, what we have to do next.
But are people, I know it's not going to be like we're going to, regulation will help, but are people here worried about what regulation will do? Because oftentimes regulators are behind. And one thing I'm worried about is data sovereignty. And that as we have more regulation, we might be seeing that all the interoperability that we've built up could break, along with geographic borders and political stuff and policies and creating more walled gardens, that it actually becomes harder to stay in compliance. So like that app you built was great, but the cloud storage may not be compliant, or your server's in a different geography. So I'm curious how everyone else is thinking about it.
Oh, and Trisha, actually, to build on what you say, imagine an even worse scenario in which those who have the time, the education, and the wealth to do data sovereignty get it. Everyone else doesn't get it. And then they form an elite club. And so now it's just even worse. And so not to say we shouldn't do anything, because I think what Dion was saying was so great, which is we are still in the cave painting days. I do want to say, and I see Melissa has a quick rejoinder, and I want to go to Ray. Ray, you said earlier that companies want to accelerate their decision advantage. And what if what we're facing is companies want to accelerate their decision advantage, but just as Dion was saying, we need to slow down a little bit. So how do we allow companies to continue to move forward at the speed of change they need to in this exponential era, but at the same time encourage a time to pause and reflect that people might just say, oh, that's just government being slow, or that's just society being slow. How do we encourage both a fast and slow approach without this getting out of kilter? So maybe first Melissa, then Ray for rejoinder, and we go from there.
Just want to pull on a thread that since I've spent a couple of months out in Missouri after being in DC for a while, and Boston before that. And so something that I've heard several times since I've been here that I find really interesting is when this comment that is statistically true, the numbers say this is true by many standards, that technology has made all of our lives better, does not resonate with people who technology has not made their life better. The life expectancy has gone down in the Midwest for certain demographics. Violence and discrimination for housing has gone up for certain demographics because of data. Data and automation have been incredibly exclusionary for very specific demographics, and those demographics are not sympathetic to one another, and that's the only reason that industry and government has gotten away with sort of dividing them onto two sides of the political spectrum and conquering. But I think we have to be very careful about believing that aggregate statistics are true for people who are experiencing this technological revolution. And I think we have to be very careful in believing that our systems that seem too big to fail at the moment are unable to fail if people decide to opt out or to break your system because it helps you, but it doesn't help me. History tells us we will blow up norms that no one thought would change when we don't worry about inclusion. And I think that we need to be leaning in hard to make sure that we care more about inclusion than the bottom line for the next 2 years. Because if companies don't, they may not enjoy the fruits of their labor in the next decade in the way that they have been wrong.
Melissa, you know, Safia Noble just made a comment who's a great writer about algorithm suppression, and she said a very similar thing where she's like, we wouldn't outlaw slavery because everybody was like, our system of capitalism is too successful, and if we outlaw it, if we make it illegal, then like our whole country will collapse, and America, our ideals will collapse and disappear. And I feel like it's exactly what you're saying, is that history tells us that we have to really figure out how do we make the right decisions and what's at stake. And I think you're totally right there. We're in that moment right now.
So Ray, your thoughts on all this, because you've heard from Dion, you've heard from Melissa, you've heard from Trisha. What do you assess about how do we make sense of this?
Well, I think what you're talking about for a pause is interesting, because I think we are moving so fast that no one has the ability to actually digest what is going on and understand the trends. And not only are we unable to digest what's going on, we've got a lot of false narratives depending on which position you're on. Like every one of those comments that we've made here could be considered a false narrative by another side, and they have equal amounts of data to prove that they're true as well, right? And that's really part of the problem. And then we've got lots of bots and deep fakes popping up that are also confusing us more. And so what we've ended up with is everybody has their own set of facts. Even though that shouldn't be the point, right? We should all have the same facts and different interpretations of the facts, but everybody has their own set of facts because nobody trusts the data. And so we really do have to spend time, if there's any part that we spend, is really coming back to institutions that we can believe in, institutions we can trust, and putting a high scrutiny and level of rigor on those institutions that are providing common sets of data, that are providing common sets of insight, that are being used as foundational bedrock sets of information to be put out there. And part of it also is that each side is so vicious in their attack on everybody else, right? So we got a case, for example, and we can argue this multiple ways, where U.S. Census data has been shut down at the end of October, right? That data should have been collected earlier is one side. The other side's we're not counting everybody, which is what the other side would say, right? And it doesn't matter which side you're on. The point being is, okay, now I don't believe in the census data. How can you make a decision based on the census data, right? Because we haven't counted everyone. Well, we've never ever counted everybody. Let's be honest, right? It's just a question of like how much is enough, right? And so we've lost this sense of proportionality, which really drives me nuts, right? We lost all sense of proportionality. And I'll say something that'll probably get me in trouble, but in one case, we have thousands of victims thousands of deaths in cities that we're not addressing, yet we're addressing an issue that might have single digits of death. Right? And that doesn't make sense. We're addressing issues of, okay, we know how many people COVID-19 will kill, right? But we also don't realize the livelihoods and the impact on livelihoods may be greater on the number of those deaths. And nobody wants to have that conversation, right? That's where AI comes in. AI is going to make the decision, and it's going to get rid of the humans, and it's going to know it's okay. No, I'm just kidding. But you get the idea. This is the challenge, right? So I can't believe your narrative because your facts aren't correct. I mean, we got to get out of that. We got to figure out how to get back to institutions that their sole mission, their sole purpose, their sole drive is to make sure that data is as accurate as it gets. People understand, yes, it's off by 0.03%. But if you're going to argue about 0.03%, go screw yourself. It doesn't make sense, right? That factor of 0.03% is not a factor, and don't even make that an issue. But we haven't gotten to that because things are moving too fast.
Yep, and so I'm going to go real quick to Dion, then to Melissa, and then to Trisha. I think I heard, and you said a lot of great things, Ray, and also some controversial, which I love. One I heard is how do people make decisions in an era in which the ratio of misinformation, disinformation, I mean, I think there was a congressional report that said at least in 2016, the ratio is 1-to-1 in terms of the level of truth to actual misinformation out there. And that was 2016.
That's better than what I thought. I thought it was 1-to-3.
So I was just saying, so how do we make decisions? How do companies, do you have any advice for companies trying to make decisions in this? And then the other thing that I also thought that was interesting, Ray, was that we're having tensions over these issues, partly because we're still treating certain things as scarcities. But maybe we could use technology to address food, to address water. We can't do everything as scarce. I mean, not everyone can live next to the coast and things like that. But when we're talking about universal basic income, can we try and say, make sure everyone has good quality food, good quality water? And that's actually something we work towards using technology. So Dion, recognizing I just handed that to you, and it's you're on the stage, but I'd be interested in your thoughts, Dion.
Well, I think we are beginning to approach a time period where we're going to ask, what's the new social compact, right? What should we what do we get for putting into society? What do we deserve to get out of it? I think we've all learned so much about the possibilities. I mean, we are beginning to be surrounded by an abundance that even 20 or 30 years ago, we couldn't even imagine, right? The level of luxuries that we have, the wealth that the world has, and what can we do with all of that, right? And again, we're just at the beginning of that. And so I think that we're going to have to ask those basic questions. How do we give everyone a fair shot at access to opportunity, right? I think right now you theoretically have more than you ever have before, but we continue to find these strange structural barriers that, with new lenses, that we've been able to uncover. So I think that I don't advocate that we should suddenly and radically restructure everything. I think we've got to learn. If we don't learn from this data, we're not going to be able to do anything, right? I mean, that's the first thing is if you have data, you have to turn it into information, right? What does it mean? And then what can you do with that? Otherwise, nothing will change, right? So this is one of the things I've seen with analytics and business intelligence and AI. All of this generates far more insight than we can absorb. You were talking about us being swamped in all of these insights. We can't operationalize it, right? So we have to figure out some basic inputs and outputs and feedback loops to actually make all these systems work. But I think it does go back to, at a basic level, we need to get back to ground truths in a way that most people can accept them, right? So how do we benchmark certain types of knowledge? We have, we have organizational standards groups in the United States and internationally that says, here's what a meter is. And we all agree with that even today. Now we can all have general agreement on basics like that. How can we take that to the next level, right? So that we can benchmark data that is more important to us in the functioning of our society in a way that most people will trust, so that we can begin to act on it, learn from it, and change things, right? So I think that's where we are right now.
Well said, Dion, and I particularly like that. Yeah, we need to find some way.
Can it get even more controversial?
No, you want to get more controversial? Go ahead, Ray.
We should have data crimes against humanity, right?
Oh,
you use
dear.
data to cause human suffering, you go to jail. You fake data to support a false narrative, you go to jail. No, I was kidding. Anyways.
Well, if I recall correctly,
Alder Platt would be in jail right now.
We'd all be in jail. We'd all be in jail.
I was going to say, if I recall correctly, I think it was a Max Headroom episode that actually they started doing court cases by television and by their equivalent of the internet then. So maybe that's what social media is becoming, is it's now the Roman Colosseum and the jury at the same time. So not sure what that looks like. But Melissa, so recognizing we're in this challenging world, and what I thought was quite interesting as well, real quick, maybe in addition to thinking about how can we maybe use an abundance mindset to maybe have something we work towards to make sure everybody can get their fair share or get their fair chances. The other thing, though, is also, do we have a hurdle that we need to get over, which is to demonstrate that representative forms of government can do this as well, if not better, than more autocratic ones? Because autocratic ones really don't care about all these issues we just talked about. They don't care if people opt in or not. And so is this also in the backdrop that we have to show that representative forms of government can do this? Otherwise, we may find autocratic governments out. Well,
it doesn't have to be representative. I mean, Elon Musk is already talking about what the first government of Mars is going to be, right there. I mean, he's putting 1 million people on Mars by 2050. He's building the rockets right now. And he says representative democracy is too indirect for when things are really important. And I think,
well, how nice for Elon. I disagree with him.
Go ahead, Melissa. So what would you say is counterpoint to Elon then?
Donner Party. Donner Party.
Look, you're right. I think that we have a really long history in the United States of distrusting the federal centralized government. Hunter Dupre wrote this amazing history of science in the United States from the 1700s up to like 1940. And everybody talks about post-World War II like it's normal. It's an anomaly in this country, and we are regressing to the norm. So first of all, people should read some history and recognize that while it doesn't repeat, it does in fact rhyme, and that's a cliche, but it's pretty true. And the fact of the matter is, we are best when the federal government lets and encourages a certain amount of bottom-up trust to be built. They accept a certain amount of authentic representation of those groups, and those groups create institutions that can negotiate and compromise not come to consensus. You are not looking for consensus. You are looking to piss off everybody equally with the results. That is what our sort of representative government has given us. Is it's supposed to be ugly and messy. I mean, when they were in writing the Constitution, they had armed guards outside and fistfights going on. I mean, it wasn't like all these like really intellectual guys sitting around writing these beautiful words and everyone was happy. They hated each other. They were screaming at each other. It's just they were using these flowery words that now we pretend are nice. I mean, they were pulling guns on the floor, right, of Congress. So
equal opportunity offenders.
Let's just recognize that we're a nation founded on rebels. We would have been terrorists if it had gone another way. We're messy, we're a little angry, we're a little shouty, we're the teenagers of the world. Just embrace what that gives us as a strength. And let's actually lean into this sort of getting back to local, getting back to empowering people to choose a certain type of organization that they're going to engage and voice their representation. It doesn't have to be Congress. It can be that we just create forums where people can actually share a point of view, and it doesn't matter if they seem a little crazy. So what? We've always been a little crazy. It's how we won the Revolutionary War. We weren't supposed to win. So I just wish people could dig deep and find like the realization that we have free will, that, you know, all of this stuff is going on in the background, but ultimately we choose our fates, and we do that with our own brains. And we can give people ways to create trusted institutions again, but that is not going to happen with a flip of a switch, with a single election, or just telling everybody, oh, trust us again. It doesn't work that way. And so I'm deeply optimistic, but I'm really worried that we keep trying to default to 1975 solutions when actually we're in a fundamentally new moment and we need a new model.
Very well said. So Tricia, I'm going to go to you real quick we've got about a little bit more than 1 minute before we go to the lightning round, but if you had a quick rejoinder, and then we're going to go to Ray, Melissa, Dion, and then finally you at the very end, Tricia, for the lightning round. So go ahead.
Yeah, I think that what we're bringing up here is actually getting to the heart of the issue of like how we actually move forward, which is thinking about how to build up bottom-up trust. And this is everybody has mentioned something about that, as like trusting in institutions. But also I want to be careful that I think that we often conflate truth and trust. And oftentimes everyone's trying to be like, well, we have to get to the ground truth. It's like, here's the big message. There is no ground truth, because all of us have different experiences. All of us, that has been the American experience, especially more than other countries, because we're all so different. This is a country of many different migrants. And even when the country was formed, there was a whole other truth of entire genocide that was happening. And would we say that's truth too? So I would say that like we have to be very careful that what we're here to figure out is not truth, because then we're going to just be in an endless battle of whose truth is better or righter or wronger. What we're really here to figure out is exactly what Melissa and Ray have said. It's about building up bottom-up trust. And what that gets us back to is exactly what we've seen versus where I feel like COVID and the pandemic and the whole uprisings has put us into, which is getting back into hyper-local forms of life. And what we have seen here with the COVID is actually the failure of big tech, is that big tech hasn't done enough or anything for the pandemic. It is not big tech, creating, solutions for us right now. But what we've seen is the failure of all the infrastructure that we thought used to work, government infrastructure, tech infrastructure, that all went away. The health infrastructure, it went away. But what actually was built was the human infrastructure. And I would put my money that the only way forward we're going to have is not in the tech. The tech is a tool, so we're going to need it. But my faith is in making sure that at the very hyper-local level, we rebuild trust so the human infrastructure comes back together. All the organizations that came about with COVID have been organizations made by people, not by machines. Our machines did not make organizations to give PPE, to people when they need it. They're not, making the testing centers. These are human infrastructures. So I'm really excited that we're talking about hyperlocal ways of organizing and human infrastructure as a way to build up these new future institutions that Ray is talking about. And that's what's going to allow us to do what Dion is saying, which is that that's going to give us the time to pause, when we have these institutions. But we have to make sure we are playing at the right scale and that we're not all the way up here. We need to be really going back to the hyper-local level.
Very well said. And I often say to people, you don't tell ants where to go. You sprinkle sugar in certain places, poison in other places, and guess what? The ants figure out how to get there without you telling what to do. So maybe that's the model we need for how we move forward. So, okay, lightning round. I'm going to ask each of you to give tweet links because we're kind of pressed for time, but tweet links. What one recommendation would you have for the private sector to do to enable this better world of hyper-local and empowerment? And then two, what recommendation would you have for the public itself to not be helpless, but to actually do something on their own behalf? So Ray, you get the first hot potato. What would be your two tweets for one for the private sector and one for the public as a whole? Then I'm gonna go to Melissa, Dion, and then Tricia.
I think for the private sector, go back to the why, your mission and purpose, and build everything against that. And treat yourself, if your company was an individual, what would they be like? How would they act? What kind of friends would you have? What type of relationships would you have? And think about personal branding. For the public sector, I think it's a little bit different. Let's focus back on institutions of trust. Let's make sure we are transparent about how decisions are being made so people don't feel that one's biases fit over another. And I think that's the main thing.
Excellent. Well said. And both are very concrete actions we can move forward. Thank you, Ray. Melissa, your recommendation first, a tweet for the private sector. What can they do? And then another one for the public sector, or public as a whole.
I think the private sector needs to look around in the physical regions where they are most heavily located, engage with philanthropy, and actually start supporting listening sessions and hyper-local community building. They don't need permission. Just do it. I don't want to steal from Tricia for the next one, but I do just, God, I just love that kind of discussion that you had at the end around this hyper-local action. And I think the federal government needs to spend less time aggrandizing itself and more time creating the space and the capability and the professionalism of local communities, states, and regions to tell them the answer, not the other way around.
Well said. And I think that's a very exciting future that we can work towards in 2021. So Dion, given your perspectives, what would be one recommendation for the private sector and one recommendation for the public as a whole?
So for the private sector, I'd say you have to rebuild trust. And if you need to make your data sources open and explainable, your algorithms open and explainable, because if you don't do it, governments are going to make you. And it's the only way to get the trust back anyway. If the Facebooks of the world want to continue to survive, the Googles are going to have to do that. For the public, I would say treat your data as an extension of yourself. It's yours. And don't give it away. Use it very carefully. Don't share it needlessly. And make sure you have your data rights on every service that you use, period.
Very well said, and that builds on, again, working to build trust, and we had in this conversation, recognize the importance of personhood associated with data that sort of builds on something that we need to move forward. All right, Tricia, you get to bring it home for us. So one recommendation for the private sector and one recommendation for the public as a whole to move us forward together.
Well, I love everything that everybody said. But for the private sector, what I would say will add on top of what everybody has said is that you need to invest in understanding your human beings like your life depended on it. And that means invest in understanding qualitative data and integrate it into your quant data. That's how you're going to get to rebuilding trust. You can't actually rebuild trust or do any of these things without understanding people. So just start at the most basic level, is just invest in learning and listening. And for people, what I would say is that I think personhood is too big of a recommendation and it's like not actionable. So what I will say is like my one-liner tweet for personal is invest in hyper-local organizing, which is what Melissa said, which is engage with your community and actually get to understand who are these people in your community and try and look for people who are different from you in a different income class or different ethnic, racial group, different experience. And because I don't want to say that hyperlocal is going to save things, because I want to remind everyone the KKK was very hyperlocal and they started out that way and they're very successful. But guess what? So was the civil rights movement and all these amazing organizations we have now that are institutions like that Ray talks about, is that they actually started out hyperlocally. So we have to think about the diversity of your hyperlocal groups. So really invest in hyperlocalism and try and make that as representative as possible of the community around you.
Really love that, and it definitely points to a way forward. Work hyper-locally with people different from you, have dinners with people that are different from you, have conversations with people different from you. I mean, that's how we will be strong as an approach that actually embraces this. I am reminded of what President Lincoln said, which is, I did not like that person, I must get to know them better. I think we need to embody the getting to know people better approach, and this is true for private sector and for public. So with that, I want to thank you all. You all have given us a jump start into 2021. This has been a really robust conversation. Thank you again, Melissa, Trisha, Ray, and Dion. I look forward to having you back on the Geotech Hour, because we will need to help people make this happen. And thank you for everything you are as positive agents, being benevolent, bold, and brave.